So good afternoon again. I'm Brandy Malatesta, the Total Compensation Director here at the Department of Public and Personnel Administration, DHR, over our Compensation and Benefits Unit. And thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for the 2023 Meet and Confer. This is the annual process where we get everyone together and we go over our annual compensation survey process and methodology. Believe it or not, even though we just hit July 1st of 2022, we are starting to plan and process salary survey data for fiscal year 23-24 to project what the market will look like then. A few things to keep in mind today is that we do ask that you please only use the Q&A function that's located on the bottom of your screen to answer any questions or to enter any questions. The chat is only going to be visible to the panelists here with us today, so your question may not be addressed. We also ask that if you need to, please put your Q&A in the box if you have, if you kind of think of it as we're going along. Otherwise, we would ask that you wait till the end of the presentation to make sure that we can kind of accommodate all of those questions. Like we said, we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can and know that we won't be able to necessarily get to it. We will address those questions at the end of the presentation. We also ask that we be mindful of keeping questions limited to the survey process for this year. We really want to make sure we cover anything related to the survey methodology and build confidence in those methods. And that's why we're here today. Also, there is a recording of the presentation section, and we will ensure that we have closed captions for that posted version, and that will be available on the DHR website along with the slide deck and an informational process document for you to refer at the end of this presentation. All right, so today, after we got those things out of the way, what we're going to cover what we're going into this year. So this year, we will be actually presenting a maintenance year, and we will be looking at our total compensation model. So just a little bit of information on what we're actually looking for in total compensation and what we actually survey and compare to the market. We will then get into some of the specific details about the annual survey process and that specific methodology. Some of those topics include looking at our labor market and how we define that here in Colorado, explaining how we benchmark jobs and actually match them to jobs in the state of Colorado, explain some of our survey sources, and then really go over that data collection, the adjustments and the comparisons, and how we actually use that market data. We will briefly highlight on the state trooper methodology that does differ a little bit from the rest of the state, and also go over our benefits methodology as we're using and comparing those salary surveys in order to publish them in the total compensation reports. So this year for our current fiscal year, we recently had July 1st, there was a 3% across the board, and the current total compensation report that is published is for fiscal year 22-23. For this report, Mercer was selected as the vendor to conduct that full total compensation analysis. So this is the fiscal year that we are currently in, and this is the report that was published on September 15th of 2021. That is the report that used the recommendations for the current across the board increase that happened on July 1st, and any other sort of potential compensation recommendations that were made within that, and also in alignment with a partnership agreement. What we'll be discussing today is fiscal year 23-24. For this year, it will be a maintenance year report. Mercer will be providing updated salary survey data, but this maintenance year report is a bit of an amended version of that total full report that you saw in 22-23. In a maintenance year, we get completely updated salary survey data, but you're not going to see the detail on the additional benefits such as benefits, the para analysis for retirement contributions. There's potentially will be updated data about shift differential, on-call pay, and some of those areas, but it's just not that full report analysis that we did in 2022 and 2023. We do have a total compensation model here in the state of Colorado. What this really comprises of is direct compensation and indirect compensation. Direct compensation is referred to as anything that is your annual base salary. So this is your actual take-home pay, that annualized salary that you see, or your monthly salary, depending on how you look at it. The indirect compensation are things that have value to employees and they do have a cost benefit, but that dollar value is not directly paid to an employee. So for example, this is medical benefits, dental benefits, life insurance, accidental death and retirement. All of those things have a dollar value, such as medical tends to be valued anywhere from 15 to $25,000 per employee, depending on which model you're looking at. And all of those things add up to a total compensation value for an employee. So even though an employee may have a base salary of $50,000, they might have another $50,000 in indirect compensation that goes into that total compensation model. The other things that we look at in our total comp model that don't necessarily have an exact dollar value are those things like work-life balance, career pathing for employees, talent development, is there training available to employees, and employee recognition. The total compensation survey process really highlights in 4 key areas. We have our labor market, where we define our labor market, right? What does that look like for the state of Colorado? Where are we actually going to pull that data from? And really, where are our competitors? Then we look at our benchmark jobs to actually match against that labor market. In these, we're going to identify those survey benchmark jobs to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples. So if we're looking at an accountant 3 job value, we want to make sure that it matches the accountant 3 in job duties in the state of Colorado. We then go to the survey step where we identify compensation and benefits survey sources, which we'll go into a little bit more detail, as well as then collect that survey data, scrub that data, review it, adjust it, and make sure that it is actually comparable. The compensation process does have a few key deadlines. As I mentioned before, we actually are already currently entering into the process with Mercer to start pooling that updated salary survey data for fiscal year 23-24. And this year, we will be actually publishing the total compensation report on October 1st. This is a change in the time frame where it was previously published on September 15th. That report then goes to the governor. If there is any potential cost impact from that report, that's presented potentially in the November 1st governor's budget. That's when all budget proposals are due. Earlier than that, but that's when the governor submits his budget proposal. And in May, following the legislative process, we typically announce anything that has a final compensation plan for the upcoming fiscal year. And then on July 1st would be the implementation of any parts of that plan. So for example, this year on July 1st, when you saw the 3% across the board that came across, as well as anything that was impacted from the partnership agreement, those would sort of follow that same sort of process. When we look at our labor market, we want to make sure that we're defining our primary labor market for actually making sure that we're collecting and comparing that salary and benefits. And I want to apologize. It looks like I missed the word prevailing in here, but we actually had a legislative change this year where we were able to remove that word prevailing to where it kind of insinuated that there was a majority in the market to where we could potentially be a little bit more competitive. So that now says innovative, and it needs to either meet or exceed the market when it comes to potential salary and benefits. So we want to make sure that our pay plans are at least competitive. And we're going to also look at those market trends in that salary budget planning information. There are a couple of professionally accepted guidelines for defining a labor market. For the state of Colorado, we want to make sure that we're looking at agencies with similar budgets, similar populations, and even direct competitors. We have a lot of highly specialized fields in the state of Colorado. We have a lot of jobs that compete directly with private industry as well as public industry. So we really want to make sure that we're comprising a robust in the cities and counties in Colorado, as well as any other public or private entities. And that's where the industry comes in. So when we actually go to pull those data cuts, we want to make sure that we have a really good representation of both public and private, because we do compete with both. And because our jobs do typically line up quite well with other public entity jobs, we want to kind of have at least a 50-50 ratio, always trying to seek at least 3 survey sources. And then we also look at geography. So we want to make sure that we're looking at the state of Colorado. So if for any reason a data cut would be located to the city of Denver, Denver Metro, or whether it was a specific county, we want to make sure we age that out to the entire state of Colorado. So we want to make sure that we're looking at everything as a whole. It's kind of come to fruition these days where maybe Denver Metro typically has higher salary survey data, maybe Vail, a different Steamboat Springs, and we have different positions in those areas in those markets. But as the state as a whole, we're looking at the state of Colorado. So we want to make sure that we're looking at the proper data cut and actually aging it to our market. We then move on to benchmark jobs. So once we really identify who we want our competitors to be, identify that we're looking at the state of Colorado, identifying that we have other comparisons out there in the market, we want to start identifying our benchmark jobs. Benchmark jobs are key to salary survey data, so you can actually create those markers and create those anchors. So we selected in fiscal year 22-23, and these will be extended into fiscal year 23-24. A total of 243 jobs were benchmarked, which was about 42% of the state's classified jobs. So close to 50%, but that 42% did represent almost 20,000 state employees. So making sure we also have a really good representation of our workforce as well, because like I said, these will serve as our anchor points. And from those anchor points, we move on to making sure that the other jobs that are slotted between these benchmark jobs are also competitive. We utilize a couple of guidelines when we're looking at benchmark selection. We want to make sure it's representative of all job families and levels throughout the organization. We also want to make sure it's a highly populated job. So to ensure that we get the most robust selection of represented employees, we want it to be highly populated. So for example, if we were presented with a classification that maybe only had 1 or 2 incumbents, it might be best that it isn't necessarily considered a benchmark job, and you could look at other sources because it is so lowly populated and wouldn't really be representative of the pay plan as a whole. We also have the jobs found in most organizations. So is it relatively found within several organizations? Are they across survey groups? Are they across different agencies, different departments? And then oftentimes we'll also look at jobs with recruitment or retention problems. And if those jobs aren't necessarily highly populated or maybe not representative of all job families, we sometimes will include them or look at them separately simply because we want to make sure that one of the reasons they don't have a recruitment or retention problem is because maybe it isn't competitive, maybe there needs to be a market shift, or maybe we just need to look at it a little bit more closely. When we come to looking at survey sources, we do have the opportunity, if needed, to create custom surveys developed for collecting benefits and retirement offerings. This year with Mercer, we were able to actually use their really robust database of several, over 30 plus years of private consulting and making recommendations and analyzing benefits and retirement offerings. So we were actually able through that to get roughly 30, I believe, public competitors, and roughly, and I do believe they're on a slide at the end, roughly another 25, 26 private competitors. So a really robust sampling for collecting those benefits and retiring offerings. We also look at published survey sources that are identified through approved compensation research, right? We have a slide, a couple of head or maybe close, where we actually give a few examples. We always look for reputable salary survey firms. We also do not try to use survey data if it's self-reported. We want to make sure that it has been vetted, median, cleaned, scrubbed, and it is a published survey source that meets our needs. We also kind of look at surveys that are conducted on a continual basis instead of a one-time event. So something that's used year after year, because once you establish those benchmarks, you want to make sure that you're as consistent as possible with that methodology and those survey sources. Any change in a data cut, i.e. the loss of a data cut, or maybe it didn't have at least 100 employees or it wasn't used, all of those over time will impact the survey results and actually how we look at it. So we want to try to make sure that we're getting cuts and things that are on a continual basis that can be reviewed year for year. And also a survey that reports its data source, the effective date of the data, and making sure that was tested to ensure that there are accurate matches in data. So we also want to make sure, again, that it's been vetted, that it has an effective date because we have to age it forward, and that we actually know where the data came from. Most survey sources will typically publish the survey participants, the organizational size, and give you a lot of different metrics about that kind of information. We want to make sure that we have access to those. And it was the next slide. So some examples of those survey sources that have published that we currently utilize are the Willis Towers Watson Survey Library. And when we say library, we're referring to a lot of different specific surveys within that library. So for example, it might be the Willis Towers Watson Public Employer Survey. It might be the Willis Towers Watson General Accounting Principle Survey or the IT survey. They all have somewhat of an area of specialization to make sure that we're getting that most representative market. We also robustly use the Mercer Survey Library this year. We also use the Comp Data Benchmark Pro Survey, which is a really great source. We reference the National Compensation Association of State Government Survey where possible, because this is a really great representation. Why it might not necessarily be a competitive market for the state of Colorado as it is, it does give us benchmarks for other state governments that actually typically match apple to apple jobs, right? Most state governments tend to mirror each other. So it really gives us a good eye on the market about what's happening in other states. What are those job descriptions looking like? And where are they going with their compensation practices? And then we also use the Employers Council Colorado Benchmark Compensation Survey and the Public Employers Compensation Survey, and then the Information Technology Survey. These are two really great surveys, well, actually 3 surveys that are really good references for us, because these also give us all the data for local city and county government comparables. So we actually know if maybe it's a job that isn't typically found in private industry, and maybe there isn't an 80% match in a private employer survey, we most oftentimes can find it in the Employers Council survey and get us that true apples to apples comparison and know what salaries actually are happening in our local area. Once that survey data collection, we've selected all of our survey sources, we've identified our benchmarks that we're going to use, and we know what data cut we're going to pull. We now actually have to start taking those benchmark jobs and actually selecting the appropriate match that's in that salary survey to actually confirm it as a benchmark job. So again, this involves comparing our job specifications for the jobs that we have selected to those comparable matches in a job survey. And we have an example coming up on a slide in a few minutes of what that actually looks like, right? Like, what does it actually look like to say, this is what a brief description of our job summary is versus what it looks like in the survey. So you can actually see what we're reading, because what we're doing is reviewing job descriptions or those job specifications in any other documentation we have access to attempt to make sure that we're understanding the duties and responsibilities of benchmark jobs. In the state of Colorado, we sometimes often have broad-banded jobs. So we want to make sure that we can, if necessary, get down to that level of duty and responsibilities, as well as the level of job function, any sort of reporting relationships. All of these things are identified in the survey data to help us ensure that we're making an apples to apples match. So it will actually tell us, is it a supervisor, or typically how many years of experience does it have? And then we follow standard comp guidelines for that job matching. We're looking for a match of at least 80% of the duties and responsibilities that are outlined between the two to actually consider it a match. We also want to identify the career level for that selective match. So again, we're going to look at the level of authority, complexity, the years of experience, but then also, is it entry, intermediate, senior, supervisor, managerial? And so what does that mean for us? So in the state of Colorado, we equate essentially, if you're looking at the job specifications, it will kind of tell you the level of authority or work that is in that. So for us, when we say entry, intermediate, senior, supervisor, managerial, we're talking about the idea of an accountant 1, an accountant 2, an accountant 3, an accountant 4. And those things typically line up with these entry, intermediate, senior, and supervisor. As much as possible, because we have job series, we want to ensure that we at least have oftentimes the entry level job if it's available, as well as a senior, either like a senior lead or a lead worker match or a supervisory match. And the reason we do that is because if you then have a good ballpark and a benchmark for an accountant 1 and perhaps an accountant 3 or 4, and it helps with slotting for the others. And oftentimes in salary survey data, you won't see every single level of a job matched, right? They're only going to also report those jobs that are often in industry. So it really gives us that opportunity to get our guardrails and then slot everything in between to also ensure that it's competitive. When we're looking the appropriate market, we've talked a little bit about this as well. We're always going to try to look at public and private sector since we do compete with both. Our geographic location is the state of Colorado. So again, we are aging data to the state of Colorado as a whole. And then looking at our organizational size, looking at our full-time employee population, budgets, and just kind of making sure it is the appropriate market match. This is a sample of a survey job description that we would see. This one was pulled from a Willis Towers Watson survey library. And this is giving you an example of an accountant intermediate. So it gives us an idea that we're establishing and maintaining accounting policies and controls, and kind of goes through some of those. The level is intermediate. So we see here that it has a working knowledge, experience in its own discipline. It's someone that's continuing to build knowledge. So maybe not necessarily a subject matter expert, but it's also not entry. It's intermediate and it's right there in the middle. Oftentimes in this survey data, and it may have, you would typically see as well, typically requires 2 to 3 years of experience or something like that. So that helps us even further match our benchmark. So for us, if I was looking at the sample survey job description, this might be an accountant 2, right? The accountant 1 would be entry. The accountant 2 would be more intermediate, someone who can come into the job and has enough of a background, but is also, growing and working on that career path as well. When we talk about survey data adjustments, this is an example of what that's going to be. So when we see at the top, you've kind of got a little bit of information about a market pricing worksheet. So you can see there that that benchmark job title was accountant 2, and that's what that description was before, right? So we did match that to an accountant 2. That survey data was updated in this example. It's an older example, but the methodology is the same. It says 7/1/2020. And that 7/1/2020 would actually be updated to 7/1/2023 in regards to the report that we're talking about today. This market trend factor, this salary budget of 3%, this is the actual amount that we usually typically age salary budgets. What this comes from is typically a World of Work standard or a Mercer standard. Employers Council also does a survey, but all your reputable compensation sources, they do annual surveys where they actually survey public and private entities and try to determine what are employers' salary budgets for that year, i.e., what do they plan to spend on compensation increases, whether that's going to be a COLA or across the board. They all kind of have an interchangeable terminology, but all kind of serve a different purpose. But the salary budget survey data tells us this is what I plan to spend in salary budgets. And per person on average, that's 3%. For the last several years, that salary budget number has been 3%. Typically, I believe in the very beginning of a pandemic turndown, I believe that salary data was reported at about 2.7%. That was actually an industry low for like the last 10 years that was reported on average. So typically, again, over the last several years and many years, it's been about 3%. So that means to you that in public and private industry, on average, employees are receiving a 3% pay increase each year. So we use that to market trend factor the salary data. So what that is also saying is that this salary data is published effective maybe September 1st of 2021, but we need to make it to 2023. So we're going to age that several months by that 3%. So that factor is going to be included in that salary to make sure it's representative of what we're actually looking for in the time frame that we need it for, because we are predicting what the market is in 23-24. Then you're looking at that survey source, making sure as oftentimes as possible, we have about 3. And then our survey job match. So you can see here in the comp data, it matched up to accountant 1. In Willis Towers Watson, it was that accountant intermediate example that you saw before. And then you see here with Mercer, maybe it was accountant experienced. You see the number of companies that responded, and then you have the number of incumbents to look at that. You're looking at the scope of the info. So this is kind of saying that that data cut for comp data was the state of Colorado. The Willis Towers Watson scope was public administration, so a really good public source. And then Mercer was Denver itself. And then all of that is then also adjusted to the state of Colorado. So the state of Colorado has its own geographical differential factor. So we want to make sure that we adjust that for that. You have the 25th percentile highlighted here, where you see that all overall average is 47,333, but we actually benchmark to the 50th percentile. So anytime we're looking at an employee incumbent average salary, we are comparing that to market median because we want to at least be competitive with the 50th percentile at that market. So again, we're always going to be looking at that 50th percentile when we're looking at this salary data. Highlighting again some of the adjustments that we did, and I talked a little bit about these in detail on this slide before. We do want to make sure that we apply those geographical differentials to ensure that that data is reflective of our labor market. And looking at to do that, we use the Economic Research Institute. So again, these are those geographical differentials that is the industry standard for assigning those. Geographical differentials are taking an interesting turn in the market currently and in the market for fiscal year 23-24, as more and more public and private employers start to have more employees work from home or work remotely. A lot of these geographical differentials, there's lots of discussion about potentially removing them. Meaning, for example, if you have an employee who previously worked in San Francisco, but perhaps is able now to work from North Dakota, both have very different geographical differentials. So it's really, in the comp industry, figuring out what we do with these geographic differences now and how they impact our markets. Not necessarily that would impact us here, but that's just an interesting piece as how, things continue to evolve and shift in compensation. And then we also discussed a little bit about the aging salary data. Again, we're aging to a common effective date of July 1st of 2023. We will typically use the World at Work. It's been an industry standard for quite some time. Mercer also has an industry standard compensation planning survey with prevailing market trends. And I actually got the Employers Council salary budget survey today to respond to actually provide us with even more relevant information for the state of Colorado and what employers are planning for employee pay increases in the next planning year. For those benchmark comparisons, we now kind of get into the statistics and calculation phase of this data. We now remember we've identified our labor market, we've identified our benchmark jobs, we've identified our salary survey sources, and we've now actually completed our benchmarking process to make sure that we actually took our benchmark job and applied it to a salary survey data in the field. We also then want to start looking at that data, scrubbing it, making sure there's no outliers, assuming that data was also assessed prior to actually being published. And then we start doing our calculations. So for each of those benchmark comparisons, we're going to make sure we're going to look at that variance. So between the state's actual average salary and the market salary is calculated. What this is going to tell us is the lag. So we actually calculate this it's not calculated two ways, same calculation, but two different looks. We look at the average incumbent salary to the actual market. So we're going to look at our average salary to 50% of the market and determine that variance and see if that equates to a lag or a lead. If it's a lag, that means that the average incumbent salaries are actually lagging the market at that 50% rate, at that 50th percentile, and potentially adjustments would be considered. Remember though, that is also kind of an aggregate number of data as well, right? Because that's the average incumbent salary. It includes employees with 1 year of experience, 10 years of experience, 15 years of experience, anyone in that classification who might be at a varying pay rate. But that's just saying that on average, the average salary potentially lags or leads that market. And then we also look at our actual pay plans. So we then compare our pay plan midpoint to the market midpoint to determine the overall competitiveness of our pay plans. That lets us know, is that salary or that pay plan even in alignment with market? Can an employer actually even make an offer that's in aligned with market? Whether that's the 25th percentile, the 50th percentile, or the 75th percentile, perhaps it came back that there would be a case, and this doesn't often happen, but say there would be a potential case for the market 50th percentile is actually more than the pay range max. That tells us that we need to do a little bit more work, a little bit more digging and see, because that's also telling me that maybe that pay range isn't competitive. But overall, a lot of the pay grades themselves are actually competitive. Some do lag the market, as you can probably see in the annual compensation report. But overall, that range is typically accommodating of market rates. The next thing we get into is the state trooper methodology. If you have ever read Colorado Revised Statute 2450-104, you're going to see that it's kind of broken out in a separate section. The Colorado State Patrol has a separate methodology, similar, but it also tells us what should be done, or like how we actually look at that market and define their market. So that methodology that's actually used is actually to look at the law enforcement officers. We have to include the top 3 law enforcement agencies in Colorado that have more than 100 commissioned officers, and then look at their highest actual average salary. That market is then 99% of that highest actual salary. This is really interesting, and it gives us a lot of good information and a lot of good data when we look at this top 3. We also look at the top 5 because that's typically industry standard, but these agencies will often change from year to year. For this state trooper methodology, if you look at the report, you will see that we're able to kind of compare them to high-level different ranking officers that are in law enforcement, also a sheriff trainee or a police trainee or police officers or sheriff's deputies, and kind of try to make that hierarchical match to match in kind of those duties. But oftentimes that top 3, and like we said, it has to have at least 100 commissioned officers. So for example, if you had one survey source that said 80,000 and it was the highest, but it only had 20 commissioned officers, we wouldn't actually use that source. You would then have to look for the highest average actual salary and then the 100 commissioned officers. So these do typically change from year to year, depending on what practices are going on in local law enforcement entities, because they will reflect what is happening in that market. And then we then look at that and do the same market methodology that we use for the other positions in the state classified pay plan. It's just different on the survey source that we have to use and the requirements of what we have to define the market at. Our benefits methodology had a really robust survey source this year. Like as we said, we reviewed benefits provided to the state of Colorado employees. So analyzing plan features and benefit levels, looking at the retirement plans, both the DC portion and the DB portion, looking at the health groups, so medical and dental. This also included things like vision, life and death disability insurance, paid leave, which is currently looked at as a total days off. Not necessarily a value attached to a dollar value attached to that paid leave, but looking at that total days off. So for example, if a new employee in the state of Colorado gets 8 days, what does that look like in the market? So someone who would be new to that entity or that employer, what do they get? We also were able to break that down by both public and private. So if you look at the total compensation report, you'll see the comparison what the state of Colorado gets compared to what public industry employees get, compared to what private industry employees get as well, and what's going on in those 2 different market comparison groups, which was really beneficial for us this year as well. Those annualized employer paid benefits, they're then computed to kind of go into our comparison groups. So for example, you're going to see that the state of Colorado value is X, the public value is Y, and the private value is Z. So we can actually see how we compare to just public entities, how we compare to just private entities, and then assess where we want to be competitive or where we need to be competitive between those 2. Those are then computed and added to that average salary income that we mentioned before to calculate a total compensation value. That's the total remuneration value. That was the wording I believe you probably saw in the total comp report from this past year. So that is taking your salary and then all of your benefits and retirement, adding those values together to get a total remuneration, and then determining where that overall led the market or lagged the market. These are the survey sources that I mentioned earlier. As you can see, we were able to do that custom analysis of 30 public sector and 26 private sector. So a really good, robust comparison this year using that benefits benchmarking database. And this was really beneficial, as we said, again, because we were able to get that public market and that private market and have those in two different sectors. So again, we're then calculating that total cash value, right? So compensation for total remuneration was your base salary or total cash. And then those benefits are those indirect benefits, right? The value of your medical coverage, dental, vision, life insurance, any sort of paid time off, or that retirement. And then this is just the example of that total compensation. This is not actually reflective of data that was in the report last year, but simply to serve as a comparison point or a visual of what we also are referring to as total compensation. So perhaps on the state of Colorado, you have a side where the total compensation package was valued at $90,000. This is inclusive of base salary, medical, dental, retirement, and incentive. So anything that would have went into that total compensation or that total remuneration value. And then you have the market. That's also with the market that 105 would be the makeup of salary, medical, dental, retirement, or that incentive. So again, pretty similar makeups of different benefits packages, whether it's primarily salary, mostly medical. You can kind of see that pie chart breakdown of which percentage of each make up the total position. And then to do that total remuneration value to determine where potentially the state of Colorado lagged. Again, these are not actual numbers that dictate the state of Colorado and market median, but more of an example. We would have done the variance between the state package of 90,000 and the market median package of 105 to get that variance and see. So in this case, you could see that the formulary would work out to where the state of Colorado lagged in this example, but again, taking that overall package of 90, the overall package of 105 in the market and determining that variance to see overall competitiveness. And I do believe, Annabelle, that is the last slide. So I definitely want to thank you for your time today. I know it is a lot of very detailed information and you may still have questions. So my email is up here as well. If you are not able to ask your question today, or if maybe we weren't able to get to it, or if you go back to this presentation later on and you have a different question related to the survey methodology, or perhaps compensation in and of itself that we can address today. But I'm also happy to open the floor to questions